Hi, good day. My name is Shabir Madhi. I'm Professor of Vaccinology at the University of Witwatersrand.
Hi, I'm William McMahon. I'm a final year Ph.D. research fellow at the Vaccines and Infectious Diseases Analytics Research Unit from the University of the Witwatersrand.
When we talk of vaccinology, it's really broadly encompassing different aspects which eventually leads up to what often happens in that children are being injected in the arms with these vaccines that they develop. So we know that especially on the African continent and in low middle income countries, despite tremendous progress having been made since 1990, where there's been more than a halving of the number of children that die before they reach the age of 5, still a large percentage of children, just under 5 million, will die each year before they reach the age of 5 globally. Now, when we look at those children that die, close on to about 2 million of those deaths are still occurring because of diseases that are vaccine preventable. But one of the reasons why we've seen this dramatic change in terms of the number of children that die each year from 10 million per year way back in 1990 to just under 5 million per year in the year 2025 is because of the impact that vaccines have had. So over that period of time, there's been a number of vaccines that have been deployed, where have been made much more accessible, especially to low middle income countries. And now WHO estimates, the World Health Organization estimates that each year between 2 and 2.5 million deaths are being prevented in children because of them receiving life-saving vaccines. When we talk of vaccinology, it's not any single aspect of what it takes to develop a vaccine. Whether or not the energy that you've invested returns any value depends on one thing and one thing only, and that is ensuring that the vaccines that are developed, that have been shown to be safe, that have been shown that they will prevent disease, actually get into the arms of children and adults.
I think one of the important things that I think we need to discuss, because it's something that you mentioned, Prof, is the timeline that it takes in order to develop a vaccine, all the way from preclinical studies to your phase 1, phase 2, and then ultimately your phase 3 clinical trials. Given the COVID-19 pandemic, I know that some people are quite concerned for the fact that, we in late 2019, there was this new virus that took the world by storm, and ultimately, when it came to the development of these vaccines, whether it was using the more traditional vaccine platforms such as your adenovirus-based vaccines, and then all the way to the newer technologies in inverted commas, focusing on your mRNA, that there were concerns that it was a rapid process that took place, but they didn't quite understand the collaborative effort worldwide in order to make this vaccine a reality. I'm not sure if you specifically have any comments to say about that.
Usually it takes up to 10 years for vaccines to be developed from the time they enter into a laboratory to the time when they license. And with COVID-19, we saw that come down to a 10-month period. Now, does that mean that we compromise in terms of understanding the safety of the vaccine? The answer to that is no. Firstly, and I think you've already alluding to this, is that the first COVID-19 vaccine, so amongst the first COVID-19 vaccines that came out, the first one that came out was sort of a vaccine using what we refer to as a non-replicating vector. So I don't want to get too technical in it. That's the first COVID-19 vaccine that was developed. And that platform that was used to develop that vaccine is a platform that those scientists have been working on for close to 20 years to develop other vaccines. And even though other vaccines were never they went into clinical trials. They were never licensed using that platform. So that was a non-replicating vector-based vaccines. But another platform that you mentioned is a messenger RNA vaccine. And I think the general public still remain under the impression that this is totally new technology, and the first time that it was actually used was to develop COVID-19 vaccines. In fact, the messenger RNA technology, and recently we had 2 individuals win the Nobel Prize for them having developed the messenger RNA technology. That technology has been in existence for close to 15 to 20 years. And they've been using the technology not in the space of vaccines, but rather as a potential therapeutic, especially in the space of cancer. And there was some progress being made. So when COVID-19 struck, when a pandemic struck, we were faced with a massive emergency. We needed to do whatever we could to prevent more individuals from dying. And that's when the scientists pivoted and decided to use that platform to develop a vaccine against COVID-19. And whole and behold, they were highly successful.
So, Professor, you've highlighted a very important aspect that was our reality during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that was the geopolitical issue in terms of vaccine access. But even with that, I think that there were very important learning curves, I think specifically from a South African point of view, in terms of what it in a way forced us to do to basically leverage on the expertise that we have from very, very skilled clinicians, from scientists in our country, to start the necessary programs and to initiate the process of developing our own vaccines, not only for South Africa, but also for the rest of the African continent.
Yeah. So I think you raised a number of important issues, and perhaps the most important part of it is for a country to be secure when faced with emergency, and for the African continent to be secure when faced with a crisis such as we faced during the COVID-19 pandemic. There has to be security of supply and access to vaccines, or else history is going to repeat itself. And unfortunately, history did repeat itself. In 2009, and people might have forgotten about it, we were faced with another pandemic, which was much less severe, caused fewer number of people to die. It was known as the swine flu pandemic. And interestingly, after the swine flu, again, there was a similar sort of narrative that Africa wasn't too affected, South Asia wasn't too affected. But the reality is that when they did an analysis of what transpired during the pandemic, they showed that more than 50% of people that died during swine flu, those deaths occurred on the African continent and in South Asia. And in neither of those regions of the world was the swine flu vaccine that was developed actually deployed. Around about 2016, the governments under the AU, a number of African governments came together and they made a political statement that we can't allow for this to happen again, that Africa needs to become self-sustainable when it comes to vaccine development and vaccine manufacture. So Africa uses about 20% of all of the vaccines that are developed globally, but we only produce 1% of vaccines. So of all of the vaccines that's especially used in the childhood program, we consume about 20% of it because of a large number of children that are born on the African continent, and clearly there's a problem here. So you're right, what happened during COVID-19, I think again there was this, so it served as a spark for governments to reflect in terms of their experience, especially not being able to access vaccines and what needs to be done. And all of the right political noises is being made. And that is, we need to develop local manufacturing capacity. We need to invest more in R&D, research and development. We need to enable our scientists to develop these vaccines on our terms, focusing on the diseases that are of priority to us rather than being dependent on some other industry where they might not see a market for a particular type of vaccine because there's not going to be a market in high-income countries, and that's a disease largely of low and middle-income countries. So it requires an investment, it requires political commitment. There's been a number of different role players that have been trying to sort of provide incentives and also resource that research and development as well as a manufacture of vaccines. So as an example, Gavi, through the extra funds that they had in the COVAX facility, earmark a large amount of funds to assist in development of vaccine manufacturing capacity on the African continent. CEPI, which is another organization, has also tried to sort of provide funds to scientists. But all of that comes to pretty much of zero value unless you have political commitment. Yeah. Now, without government investing in its scientists, unfortunately, the type of wishful thinking that we have, that we're going to be able to develop, do the R&D around vaccines, come up with novel vaccines and start manufacturing those vaccines is going to be a pipe dream. We need real money. We need commitment on the part of government to actually invest. So Willem, I know that you're really interested, and as you mentioned, your interest as a virologist is really to apply it and sort of understand what it takes to develop vaccines. And I think we've seen tremendous progress over the past 20, 30 years in terms of the number of new vaccines that have been developed. But more interestingly and more excitingly is a number of new sort of vaccine technology, vaccine platforms that are emerging. So perhaps do you want to reflect?
Sure. I think in terms of vaccine technology, as technology improves worldwide, I think we will be bombarded with so many new and innovative ways of either making new vaccines and also delivering vaccines at the end of the day. Because face it, not everybody is a big fan of sitting there and waiting for that big needle to puncture your arm in order to receive your vaccine. So in terms of vaccine, there's so much potential when it comes specifically to developing new ways of delivering vaccines. But I think that the list of newer technologies that can be applied to make, or as platforms to make new vaccines, is not exhaustive at the moment. I think it's an ongoing process. So as technology improves, more innovative ideas might come forth. And I know that mRNA, some people might consider the mRNA vaccine platform as the silver bullet. I don't necessarily think it is the silver bullet. I think there is still space for some of the other type of vaccine production technologies out there. So it's an ongoing landscape, and I think the more we learn about our organisms of interest, specifically in South Africa or in the African context, I think it will prickle our curiosity in order to develop newer ways to address these issues. So, Prof, one of the key things that you mentioned is about commitment from government, but in terms of funding the necessary research, funding the necessary projects that can ultimately ensure that we either develop these vaccines ourselves, and also to identify potential newer targets that we can use. Obviously, you're much more involved in all of these other organizations. Is there anything specifically that you want to say, or at least want to highlight the severity of these funding cuts in the South African context?
Yeah. So I think the funding cuts we're obviously referring to is not just from the US government, which has indicated that they're planning on reducing funding for research, not just in the field of medical sciences, but also in a number of other fields. And what they're proposing would be quite drastic, in that to some extent they talking of cuts of close to 2/3 of the budget which they used to allocate to research in the past. More recently, fortunately, in the past 1 or 2 weeks, there's been some sort of sanity return to the discussion, and certainly for the National Institute of Health, they've indicated that the budget cut is unlikely to be as severe as they were planning to do, but it's still at risk. In addition to the US, there's other governments, including the United Kingdom, that have actually reduced the amount of money they're allocating to foreign aid. And we can expect the same to happen from many other European countries as they come under pressure to invest more funds in arms development and procurement of arms in preparation for war, rather than allocating funds to develop vaccines. But in addition to that, you also know that the impact is not just on researchers, it's also on people that are involved in policy, in implementation. So as an example, at the World Health Organization, the US has withdrawn all funding to the World Health Organization, and they were one of the countries with the largest contribution. So how does that impact us? The World Health Organization is there to assist especially low middle income countries in terms of strengthening the immunization program, making recommendations, etc. And at times they might have interventional teams work together hand in hand with country staff to ensure that, as an example, vaccine coverage is where it should be. So there's likely to be multiple effects, but it all speaks to an issue as to how much longer should African countries remain dependent on donors, and is it actually the responsibility of donors to start off with to be funding something as basic as healthcare services and to make sure that children are actually getting vaccines. So there's no better investment other than access to clean water than vaccines. It's estimated that for every $1 that you spend to vaccinate a child, to immunize a child, the return on investment is $20. So it's a no-brainer that this is something that African countries in the low middle income countries need to be investing in. So to some extent, what you're experiencing with the funding cuts that's taking place compels us, especially including in South Africa, but on the African continent, for governments to step up and take responsibility. They need to take responsibility for ensuring that they're investing in our scientists. They need to make sure that resources are being provided to the scientists for them to do what's expected of them. And that is to address the public health concerns that we face as a country, not just at the tail end in terms of implementation, but right from the discovery part. So The future as to whether we do become secure in terms of vaccine supply when we face the next pandemic, and I'm hoping that's after my current lifetime, it all depends on the investment that we make today. We can't be making an investment the day the next pandemic starts, because it takes closer to 2 to 3 decades for us to get from where we are if we are wanting to start producing vaccines from the bench into the arm of children. So to me, yes, it is disappointing to have these funding cuts, but I think to some extent these funding cuts is basically getting scientists to rethink how they go about doing their work, but it needs to compel governments to understand that it is in their interest and the interest of the people they serve, which is the public, for them to start investing much more in terms of funding of research. And South Africa, as an example, needs to make that commitment that 1.5%, despite all of the economic challenges that we face, there needs to be greater efficiency in the spend of funds, and we need to be able to ensure that over the next 2 to 3 years, 1.5% of our budget is geared towards funding of research. So, Willem, I remember that I think it was around about 2022. You sent me an email to find out whether there was any opportunity for you to do any research. And I think your interest was specifically on COVID-19. So what is it that sort of got you to come out from the private sector where you were busy with and decide to do a PhD?
I've always been passionate about how I can bring virology and vaccinology together by developing vaccines, but also testing the efficacy of vaccines. So at that time, I had a lot of experience with pathogen discovery and characterizing pathogens, but now the logical step for me was to learn more about vaccines, how it's being used and evaluated in a clinical space, and ultimately, after you've evaluated a vaccine through clinical trials, what is the logical next steps and how it's being rolled out into public. So at the time when I was doing my master's, I was in talks with a couple of people, and one of them was the other dean of the Faculty of Health Science, Prof. Shetty, and he referred me to you and your group, and I started reading up about all of the wonderful work that I think at the time it was still called RMPRU, the Respiratory and Meningeal Pathogens Research Unit, if I'm correct. And that's when I decided, before my master's and before I started with my PhD, I just wanted a brief of an industry break to see how far personally I can go in research within industry in the South African space, but I always knew that my passion lies within research. Yes, industry is appealing in certain aspects, but for me, the passion about doing research by specifically focusing on translational research all the way from virology and linking it to vaccinology and to make a product that can ultimately help people.
For me, one of the real pleasures of having supervised you is just to see how much the PhD has equipped them to actually advance their careers. And I mean, and it's something that I pride myself on, and I pride for VIDA having provided students an opportunity to sort of accelerate their careers. But we can't do it alone. This is where government funding needs to come in play. And that's what I'm saying. Unless more opportunities are actually created by government through funding, having people graduate to PhD can be a complete waste of resources. And the only way that it's going to succeed is for government to put more money into research, for industry to be incentivized to take on more graduates, PhD graduates, for them to start doing R&D so that we can start going to what we're really aspiring to do. And that is for us to start do research on vaccines in the labs, right through manufacture those vaccines in South Africa, and ensure that the vaccines get into the arms of children so that we can save lives.